Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you. There is no handout today. Don't worry, you did not miss it. I just kind of realized that almost everything on the handout is from the Bible, and it kind of works for me to just put that up on the screen. Let me turn this volume down just a little bit so I'm not screaming at you. Let's try. Is that better? That's a little better. Yeah? Yeah, good. You're welcome. You're welcome. You know, different people use the microphone, and some days I wear it over here, and some days here, and it's never quite the same. But it's good to be together. So no handout today. We're just going to look at the screen. I'm still going to get some volunteers to do some reading. Let me make that big enough, hopefully, for us to see. And let's start with this prayer. It's a familiar prayer, I think, to many of us. We use it in our service. Sometimes we use it in our service for healing. It's from the prayer book, and it's just a beautiful prayer of reminding us that it is in God's presence that we find faith. Let's pray this prayer at the top of the screen out loud together. O God of peace, who has taught us that in returning and rest we shall be saved, in quietness and confidence shall be our strength. By the might of your Spirit, lift us, we pray, to your presence, where we may be still and know that you are God, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Would somebody be willing to run the microphone around the room for us? John, first hand I saw was John's. Thank you. We're not going to run it. It's not on yet, John, but we're not going to run it around. I just want to get quick answers to this, and I'll say them so that so you can the people online can hear it. But when you think of the Bible and you think of a part of the Bible that is hard to believe, whether that's hard for you to believe or maybe it's just hard for other people to believe, I'm not asking you to say which, but when you think of a part of the Bible, a story in the Bible, something about the Bible that's hard to believe, what comes to your mind? Just raise your hand or just call it out. Yeah, what comes to your mind? What comes to your mind? Yeah. The flood. Great. Yeah. What else? And the more I study it, the harder it is to believe, right? Yeah. Daniel. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Lion's den, the whole works, right? Fiery furnace, yeah, the whole, yeah. What else? What else comes to mind as being hard? Yeah. Pillar of salt. I thought about using that one, but chose not to. But maybe we'll throw it in there. It might be better than some of the others. Yeah, pillar of salt. Yeah, for looking back. Yeah, right? Yeah. Yeah, what else? What else comes to mind when you think of hard to believe things from the Bible? Anybody want to say the whole thing? The whole thing? Yeah, the whole thing? Yeah. Yeah, I think the reason that we feel that, not only about certain stories, but about the whole thing, is because of the ways that the Bible has been taught and talked about and worshipped. The Bible has become an unassailable document, and as a result, it feels like we're forced to choose all in or all out. And I think that's a ridiculous and horrible way to approach the Bible. I approach every passage differently, and I'll approach it differently just about every time I'll read it. And what I hope to get from this series is not the answer for how to interpret Balaam and his talking donkey. I do not expect us to leave this series thinking, oh, I understand why God turned Lot's wife into a pillar of salt. Like, that's not what we're going to get. But if we're able to, in this space, in a church space, to ask questions like, am I supposed to believe that? How am I supposed to believe that? Why am I asked to believe it? If we can ask those kind of questions, then whether it's a passage of the Bible or the way somebody's talking about the Bible or something else that we hear related to our faith, I think it helps us approach it with that appropriate, organic, whole person self. We are supposed to approach Scripture not only with our hearts and our minds, but with our spirits and our souls and with our neighbors and with our experiences and with all of the scientific and historical knowledge that we can bring, all the literary criticism and archaeological research. We can bring it all to the text, and that should strengthen our commitment to what God is trying to show us. And if it doesn't, we're not on the right path. So that's my hope for this series. There's the outline for the series. Just take a look at some of those. You can probably guess what some of those passages are. We're going to talk about the talking donkey today. Next week, we're going to look at Jonah and the whale. Then we're going to look at Jesus cursing the fig tree. I wanted to get at least a little bit of a New Testament passage in there. We'll talk about dry ground. We'll talk about the wrestling match. And then on May 21st, it's not a part of the series, but don't forget that we're celebrating our 175th anniversary as St. Paul's. And so during the forum that day, we'll be talking a little bit about our history. So just know that that's coming. So we got 5 weeks to have this conversation. And I could have picked different passages. I've taught this series before. None of these stories was in the series. We talked about resurrection and empty tomb. We talked about some of the miracles from the New Testament. Talked about a couple of the horrible stories from the Old Testament where God says, kill everybody. So this is a pattern. This is a pattern. And again, we're not going to answer your questions, but hopefully we're going to give all of us some tools to approach the Bible fresh and faithfully. Fair enough? All right, so today we're going to talk about Balaam and the talking donkey. I'm going to ask a series of questions. How many of us feel like we've never even heard of Balaam and the talking donkey before? And that's an okay thing. If you've never... It's not even familiar. A couple of us, great, lovely. That's a lot of us. All right, great. How many of us kind of recall those names, but couldn't really tell you much about the story? Yeah, the other half of us. Does anybody in the room want to say, actually, I read that story last week and I know it really well. Does anybody know that story really well? Yeah, I didn't either. But whether you come to this with zero knowledge, with some scant knowledge, or a deep knowledge of the text, we'll read it fresh, and we'll trust that the story is going to speak to us. And of course, as the title for today's class, Talking Donkey, implies, one thing of interest is that the donkey is going to speak. It's going to be a talking donkey, and that's of interest. But of course, I think it's even harder to ask or to understand, why does God do what God does through the talking donkey? Right? If the talking donkey is the easy part, it's the rest, I think, that's even harder for us to understand. So let's see how that unfolds. We're not going to read the whole story. It takes chapter 22, 23, and 24, maybe even 25, I can't remember, but at least 3, maybe 4 chapters of Numbers. We're not going to read all that, but we've got most of chapter 1, so we've got a pretty good amount of the text. And that heading says through 35, but I extended it this morning. I was reading it. I thought, you know what? Let's go a little further. Let's go to 40. We're going to go through 40. And let's read it. And if you'll trust me to scan it across the screen, the first person is going to be asked to read 3 paragraphs, and then there'll be another person to read 3 paragraphs. Who would read the first 3 paragraphs for us, realizing that it's up on the screen, so if you can't see it very well, then you probably shouldn't volunteer. Who would read that for us and use the microphone to read it? Who might do that for us, please? Thank you, Dave.
Then the people of Israel set out and camped in the plains of Moab beyond the Jordan at Jericho. And Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. And Moab was in great dread of the people, because they were many. Moab was overcome with fear of the people of Israel. And Moab said to the elders of Midian, "This horde will now lick up all that is around us, as the ox licks up the grass of the field." So Balak, the son of Zippor, who was the king of Moab at that time, sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Beor, at Pethor, which is near the river, in the land of the people of Ammon, to call him, saying, "Behold, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover up the face of the earth, and they are dwelling opposite me. Come now, curse this people for me, since they are too many for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land, for I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed." So the elders of Moab and the elders of Midian departed with the fees for divination in their hand, and they came to Balaam and gave him Balak's message. And he said to them, "Lodge here tonight, and I will bring back word to you as the Lord speaks to me." So the princes of Moab stayed with Balaam. And God came to Balaam and said, "Who are these men with you?" And Balaam said to God, "Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, has sent to me, saying, Behold, a people has come out of Egypt, and it covers the face of the earth. Now come, curse them for me. Perhaps I shall be able to fight against them and drive them out." God said to Balaam, "You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." So Balaam rose in the morning and said to the princes of Balak, Go to your own land, for the Lord has refused to let me go with you. So the princes of Moab rose and went to Balak and said, Balaam refuses to come with us. Once again, Balak sent princes, more in number and more honorable than these. And they came to Balaam and said to him, Thus says Balak, the son of Zippor, let nothing hinder you from coming to me, for I will surely do you a great honor, and whatever you say to me I will do. Come, curse this people for me. Balaam answered and said to the servants of Balak, Though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the command of the Lord, my God, to do less or more. So you too, please stay here tonight, that I may know what more the Lord will say to me. And God came to Balaam that night and said to him, If the people have come to call you, rise, go with them, but only do what I tell you. So Balaam rose in the morning and saddled his donkey and went with the princes of Moab.
Thank you. We haven't even gotten to the talking donkey part. So what do you notice? Like, what's interesting? What's going on? Like, just help me understand what's going on here. Who are these players? What's happening? Why does this concern God's people? Who can summarize what we've heard so far for us? Who's got a sense of what's happening? Yeah. Yeah. It helps that I read it last night. Yeah. So, where's Israel in this story? What's happening to Israel? Dave's going to tell us what's happening to Israel.
Yeah. So Israel has been wandering through the desert, and they're landed in Moab or near Moab.
Yeah.
And they are moving in.
And they're numerous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the people of Moab have seen what the nation of Israel has done to one community after another as they move into this land. So Israel, the people of Israel, have gone from being slaves in Egypt to being nomads in the wilderness, and now they're coming into the land of promise, the land of Canaan, the Palestine, and they're coming in and they're defeating their enemies. And one by one, because God is with them, they're falling. So you remember Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, right? You might have sung that as a kid, right? They blew the trumpets around the city, and this great fortified city crumbled and fell. The point of that story, which we're not reading in this series, but the point of that story is, like, God helped Israel win these victories. So the king of Moab, the whole nation of Moab, is like looking down in the valley, and they see this nation coming at them, and they panic, right? They're going to get us. Like, they're leaving a wake in their midst. It's like if you're a high school football coach, and you know in the 8th week of the season you're playing the reigning state champ who has always beaten you, and your team hadn't beaten them in 25 years. Like, you can go ahead and circle that on the calendar. It's coming, and there's a sense of like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And so, sure enough, the king of Moab says, I know what we're going to do. We're going to ask Balaam to help us. All right. So my second question is, so what's Balaam's job? Like, why is Balaam being asked? I'm not asking you to agree with it, but just sort of what's Balaam? Who is Balaam? Balaam? What's his job? You might know. How would you describe what he does? Ambassador? Yeah. And what are they asking him to do? They use the word a couple times. What did they say? So we want you to come and hold on. Yeah, verse 11. Look at verse 11 right in the middle of the screen. If I can find my cursor again. Right there, right? Behold, a people has come out of Egypt, that is Israel, and it covers the face of the earth. That's how numerous they are. Now come curse them for me. Perhaps I'll be able to fight against them and drive them out. Now that's a little strange. It's a little strange. But imagine if your job, your whole career had been an inspirational speaker. Right? Like, there are people who do this, right? They travel to football teams and they give inspirational speeches before big games, right? So your job as an inspirational speaker, and whoever Balaam comes to and says, guys, we can do this, we can do it, they win. But he's also being asked to curse. So he's going to go to the Israelites, in effect. It's kind of like him going to the Israelites saying, you know what, y'all aren't as numerous as you think you are. I heard some dissension over there in the corner. You think those catapults are going to help? Your swords aren't sharp. You're old. You're young. You don't know what you're doing. Like so essentially, Balaam's job is to kind of undermine the work of Israel by cursing them, right? Which we don't do a lot of cursing these days. Have you seen the meme? It's either a dad joke or something similar to it, where the spouse calls from downstairs. Have you ever had a pain in your back like someone was stabbing a voodoo doll? And the spouse goes, "No, I haven't." And then the voice from downstairs goes, "What about now?" Right, so we don't do that, but the text seems to imply that Balaam is this character whose job it is to curse. And the king of Moab says, "I need all the help I can get." Heard about this Balaam guy? Balaam guy's got an in with the divine powers, the forces of the universe. And if I can get him to curse Israel, maybe I'll have a chance. That's where we are so far, all right? Given that, what do you think? Like what at this point in the story, what's the Bible trying to tell us? Like what is it setting us up for? What are the questions we are wondering? Like the suspense that the narrator is building for us. What are we interested to see at this point? Will he be successful? That's part of it. What else? Will he even go? Right? So I think we forget that Balaam doesn't belong to Moab. Balaam doesn't belong to Israel. Balaam's just a guy, like a Near Eastern guy. He, in the rabbinic tradition, he is known as one of the 7 Gentile prophets. And the other ones are the 2 people with Balaam, his 2 servants. They're given names in the rabbinic literature. And then Job and Job's 3 friends. Right? That's it. Those are all the Gentile prophets. But the tradition holds that Balaam, even though he wasn't an Israelite, like for whatever reason, God had given him some power. And so if Balaam says, "Bless you," then you're going to be successful. And Balaam says, "Curse you," then you're not going to be successful. And so just allow yourself to buy into the story, right? Imagine that you're watching a Marvel movie. Like, it doesn't do a lot of good to say people don't fly or people can't shoot fire. Like, you want to enjoy the movie. You're right, but you want to enjoy the movie. So for the purposes of the story, like, just allow the strangeness of this narrative to unfold. And then we'll come back and ask why. So allow the strangeness of the narrative. Balaam has the power to bless or curse. The king of Moab sends him and says, "Come, I need you to curse my enemies." And what was Moab's response the first time? No, won't do it, right? Won't do it. God showed up. God said, "Don't go." And he says, "Sorry, can't go." So at the beginning of this second paragraph, right, the princes of Moab return, and they say he refuses to go. So then the king goes, "All right, I'm going to send more princes. I'm going to send more money. I'm going to send more ambassadors. And they're going to tell you, we'll give you whatever you want. We'll give you whatever you want. You can have any honor, you name it. All you got to do is come and curse my enemies." And Balak says, "I can't do it," right? And I think this is an important verse for us to hold on to if we're going to understand the story, right? "Even if King Balak were to give me his entire house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the command of the Lord my God to do less or more." Notice that Lord is in those little capital letters, which lets us know that's the proper name of Israel's God. So even though Balaam is not an Israelite, he is invoking the name of Israel's God. He is allied. He is beholden to Israel's God. But then God shows up and says to him the second night, says, "All right, look, if they've come to call you, go on. But when you go, what? Do only what I tell you." Right here in verse 20. Do only what I tell you. So he rose in the morning and saddled his donkey and went. All right, what would you ask of the text at this point? Questions, comments? What would you say to the text? What do you want to know more about? What are the problems that you see with the text? What's the confusing part of the text? What do you want to wrestle with? And John will bring you the microphone so we can hear you. What do you think? What do you think? Yeah? Yeah, right behind John, right next to you. Would you hand the microphone? Yep, thank you.
So I would say I'm a little jealous. I wish that God would tell me what to do.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know?
yeah.
Only do what I tell you. I'm like, yes, I would do that. Just tell me.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Let me ask not you a question, but let me ask us a question. Do you believe that God spoke to people any more clearly then than now? I don't. Which says a lot about the nature of the text and how it gets told, right? You know, because ask your grandparents about how they met and fell in love. and they will tell you the story probably of remarkable destiny. Like they were destined. Like you know those stories. If you had asked them the year after they got married, I bet the story would have sounded different, right? Because a lifetime of love teaches us to reflect back on things differently. And I think we see some of that in this. So I'm like you. I wish God would speak to me like this, but I have a feeling that 40 years from now, I'm going to look back and think, oh, God was, right? Yeah. What else do you notice? What else do you ask of the text? That's a great one. What else do you ask of the text? What do you want to know more about? What do you want to say to God after this? Yeah? Yeah, up here. Sally, here comes the microphone. Thank you, John.
Why is this guy beholding to the Lord?
Yes. Like, he's not Israelite. Why does he belong to God? Why does he care what God says? What's that supposed to teach us? Like, what does it mean that this foreigner who's been offered a lot of money and power and prestige would say no because Israel's God has said don't do it? Like, I think the reader is supposed to say, something's going on here. God is active in Balaam's life. Like, imagine think about all the stories in the gospel accounts where a notorious sinner comes up and reveals the deepest content of faith. And the crowd goes, she gets it, he gets it, that's odd. Like, of all people? And the answer is yes, of course, of all people. That's the way God works. Yeah. What else? What else do you observe or notice in the text? All right, well, let's get to the good part. Who would read the next bit? 3 more paragraphs. Who would read the next bit? Thank you, Jonathan. All the way across the room.
But God's anger was kindled because he went, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as his adversary. Now he was riding on the donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. And the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword in his hand. And the donkey turned aside out of the road and went into the field. And Balaam struck the donkey to turn her into the road. And then the angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path between the vineyards with a wall on either side. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she pushed against the wall and pressed Balaam's foot against the wall. So he struck her again. And then the angel of the Lord went ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn either right or left. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she lay down under Balaam. And Balaam's anger was kindled, and he struck the donkey with his staff. Then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, "What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times?" And Balaam said to his donkey, "Because you have made a fool of me. I wish I had a sword in my hand, for then I would kill you." And the donkey said to Balaam, "Am I not your donkey on which you have ridden all your life long to this day? Is it my habit to treat you this way?" And he said, "No." Then the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand. And he bowed down and fell on his face. And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? Behold, I have come out to oppose you, because your way is perverse before me." Then the donkey saw me and turned aside before me these 3 times. If she had not turned aside from me, surely just now I would have killed you and let her live. Then Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, "I have sinned, for I did not know that you stood in the road against me. Now therefore, if it is evil in your sight, I will turn back." And the angel of the Lord said to Balaam, "Go with these men, but speak only the words that I tell you." So Balaam went on with the princes of Balak. Then Balak heard that Balaam had come, and when he went out to meet him at the city of Moab, on the border formed by the Arnon, at the extremity of the border. And Balak said to Balaam, "Did I not send to you to call you? Why have you not come to me? Am I not able to honor you?" Balaam said to Balak, "Behold, I have come to you. Have I now any power of my own to speak anything? The word that God puts in my mouth, that I must speak." Then Balaam went to Balak, and they came to Kirith-Huzoth, and Balak sacrificed oxen and sheep and sent for Balaam and the princes who were with him.
Thank you. You can already see the first question that I have for you. Like, isn't it odd that God told him to go and then got angry about him going? Like, so just remember that the people who wrote the story down and transmit it, they noticed that. That's a part of the story, and we're supposed to wonder why. Why would God say go and they get angry about going. What does that say about God? And more importantly, what does that say about Balaam? And even more importantly, what does that say about us? Right? So just allow yourself to notice those kind of odd contradictions and not need them to have a simple answer. Like they are an invitation for exploration. When the text surprises us, when God sounds like God is contradicting God's self, it's an invitation for us to wonder about it and to say, why aren't those things lining up? Why does one account say Friday and the other say Saturday? Like, why aren't those lining up? That's an invitation. So what do you notice? What's interesting to you in this story? What's challenging to you in this story? How would you respond to what we've read so far? And John will bring you the microphone if you'll raise your hand. Yeah. The idea of the animal being more perceptive in the moment. Yeah. What does that tell us? Like, just hold on to that. What does that tell us about donkeys? What does it tell us about God? And more importantly, what does it tell us about us? Right? What does it tell us about us that we would be blind? Yeah. Thank you. As Sally says, that we're more stubborn than a jackass. Right? Yeah. Right? Yeah. All right. What else do you notice of the story? What else is interesting to you of the story? Yeah, Mandy, right in the green. Yep. Hold on a second. Here goes the microphone.
I was just going to say that God keeps a tight leash. It seems like a tighter leash on someone that's about to go do something really important on behalf of God. Yeah. And so he wants to make sure, I've sent you out. Don't say anything until I tell you. Yeah. But then on the journey, he's just reminding you, I am right here. And so he doesn't have a long leash. I am right here just as a reminder. Yeah. Don't say anything until I tell you. So I just would say that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, when you send a kid out the door and you tell them to look both ways when they cross the street, it's what we say, but when we're sending them across, Highway 45, right, we say it again, right, even though they've heard us, even they know it, right, because, we're talking about the highway, right? So I think part of the point is we need to hear God say to Balaam again, did you hear me the first time? I want to make sure. Yeah, I think there's absolutely an echo in that story, yeah, which isn't just about Balaam, it's about us, right? And I hear you inviting us to imagine when we are facing something big, and our donkey doesn't start speaking to us, will we recognize when we're actually supposed to pay attention? Yeah, God, in theory, had given Balaam everything that Balaam needed to know from the beginning, and yet the story unfolds this way because we need to hear it again, right? Yeah. All right. What else catches you about the story? Yeah, all the way up here, Mike.
Balaam's having a nice ride on his donkey.
Yep.
And he's blinded by his own perception of what he believes this trip is all about.
Yes.
And so he doesn't see the angel appear.
Yeah.
And his total perception of everything is just nothing but clouds and fog.
Yep. Yeah.
And it's the perception of the donkey who seeks first to protect him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Against himself.
Absolutely. And what's so interesting is Balaam is faithful. Balaam is described as prayerful. We are supposed to be shocked that Balaam the foreigner is beholden to Israel's God in this clear way. He will not go unless God tells him to go, and yet still he can't see it. What does it mean that even when we're doing our best to be faithful, sometimes our perception is hidden? Sometimes God's got to use another outside agent, maybe where we would least expect it, to remind us of something. Yeah, follow up.
Well, I keep seeing this thing evolving Balaam, I need you to go.
Yep.
And so here goes Balaam. No, dude, not right now.
Yeah.
I mean, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Hold up for a day. Let me get my stuff together. I got a few things you got to see on the way.
Yeah.
But he just launches headlong.
Yes. Yeah. One of the questions I like to ask is, if you were the director of this movie, how would you shoot it? You could make Balaam a really flat character, right? You could make Balaam an uninteresting character. You could focus on the donkey, but I think there's a lot going on in the mind and life of Balaam.
he thinks he's ready, but he's not. He thinks he knows what's going on, but he doesn't. He thinks he's being faithful. Is he? I think we're supposed to ask those questions. Can you think of any other animals in the Bible that talk? Can you think of any other animals in the Bible? Yeah? The snake. It's the only other one. There are only 2 animals in the Bible that speak like this. The snake in the garden in Genesis 3 and the Balaam's donkey. Isn't that interesting? What is it? I'm not asking for an answer, but what does it tell us that the ancients would associate God showing up or truth or insight showing up in those 2 moments? Like, you could preach a sermon about the relationship between the snake in the garden and the donkey Balaam rode on. Anyway, I might have mentioned this before, but a summer camp session was back in Alabama. One of the theme were the donkeys of the Bible. And they heard the story of Balaam's donkey. They heard the story of the donkey that carried Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, the donkey at the end of Jesus' life that comes into... So anyway, donkeys are themselves interesting, but interesting that this one talks and none of the others talk. So I'm going to ask you this question, and I want you to join me in kind of thinking on the other side of it. Like, if your child came back from Sunday school or vacation Bible school, or your grandchild or your neighbor if you don't have children, and said, we heard the story about Balaam and the donkey, and they said to you, like, why would God reveal something to a donkey that he wouldn't reveal to Balaam? How would you offer that? What are the ancient people of God? What are the people of God supposed to understand about how God is at work? Begin to step back from the story and allow it to teach us something besides the marvelous. What's God up to? Yeah, Dean.
I think it illustrates kind of the frustration of scenarios that we don't know about until we're told.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's hard to be a kid, isn't it? It's hard to be told this is the way it is because I said so, right? And I think there's a humanization of that kind of struggle. Yeah, I like that. Thank you. What else? And what does it mean for us to approach a circumstance from a position of humility? Like to recognize that maybe I can't see everything. Yeah, I think there's a lesson there. What else? Yeah, Julie, right in the middle.
Well, I think God speaks to us in ways we don't understand and we aren't often aware of.
Yeah.
Or maybe certainly not always aware of.
Yeah.
And in all creation, and that God is in this donkey is just, God is in everything.
Yeah.
And I love donkeys, and I just love it. I love this story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you cannot believe that a donkey spoke, can you believe that sometimes God speaks to us in ways that surprise us? Surely. Even if it's that voice, we all have that voice inside of our head, right? That voice that sometimes surprises us with the insights, right? Can you believe that God would use someone you didn't expect to show you something deeply true about yourself? Sure. Yeah, so if God is in the business of revealing truth to us in ways that defy logic or explanation, why not a talking donkey? Or maybe another way to say the same thing is, isn't it funny how God uses a talking donkey to remind us to look for truth in places we otherwise wouldn't expect it, right? Yeah. It didn't have to be this way, right? You can cut the donkey out of the story. It's not as good a story. We don't teach it to our children. Like, think about it. Like, children know, like if you Google Balaam, you will find YouTube videos that are designed for elementary school children that tell this story in really simplistic ways, kind of good ways. I thought about showing one, and it's funny. It does things like instead of explaining to us that God told Balaam not to go and then told Balaam to go, it says Balaam was afraid to go. Right? It's interesting anyway. So because sometimes you got to dig a little deeper in the story. But if we don't have the donkey, it's fine. It's a fine story. There's something to be learned, but would we learn it the same way? Surely not. The fact that it's a story that we would teach our children invites us to learn it as children again. And sometimes we need to approach a story the way that our kids or our grandkids would. Do you remember how the story of Balaam ends? Do you remember this? Do you Remember this? Some of y'all paid attention in Sunday school, right? So they go and they offer the sacrifice, right? And then as soon as the sacrifice is offered, Balaam opens his mouth and he blesses Israel instead of curses them. And Balaam's like, what are you doing? I'm paying you to curse them. Wrong words. Let's try this again. So they go to another place. And Balak says, look, this time you won't be able to see the whole nation. You'll just be able to see like a sliver of them. Let's try this again. And sure enough, Balaam opens his mouth and again blesses Israel. And Balak says, no, again, you did that wrong. Let's go over here where you can't see any of them. And they do it again and again. And 4 times, 4 different sacrifices, Balak asks him to curse Israel. And Balaam can't help but to sing the praises of God, the God of Israel, and to bless God's people. Would we have been able to hear the radical nature of Balaam's refusal to give in to Balak and the money and the power without also seeing him hit his donkey 3 times because he couldn't see what was going on? Like, there are insights into this story, just both the story, but even more importantly, bigger than the story, that we get through the fantastical, if you'll allow me to use that word, right? So let me move away from the story to some questions that I think we're going to ask every time. So what happens if we read the story as literal, historical, factual truth? Like, what happens if I tell you the donkey spoke? If you had been there, you would have heard it as plain as day. You might not have understood the language because it wasn't speaking English, but you would have known the donkey was speaking. Like, can we say that? Can we preach that? Can we, like, does the story, and Mandy, can this story hold up if it's presented to us as just literal truth? Yeah.
I would say absolutely.
Yep.
I think I might switch out the word spoke to communicate.
Yeah.
I mean, I think anybody that's had a pet, a dog that they're really close with, those dogs do communicate.
Yeah.
Very much what their feelings are, and somehow inwardly I know what they're saying.
Yeah.
I find the appearance of the angel way more far-fetched than the donkey speaking.
Yeah. Thank you.
I mean, that's just me.
Yeah, and I'll take that one further. I find it harder to wrap my mind around a God who would say, go, and then threaten to kill you with a sword because you did exactly what God told you to, than I do about a donkey communicating. I like that, yeah. What else? Other responses to the invitation to think of this as just plain old history book. Anybody else saying, yeah, I wouldn't teach it that way. What do you think? Anybody else? Yeah? All right, well, what about the other side? Does the story lose its power if we can only hear it as a myth, a metaphor, an image, an analogy, a fable? So if you tell your child the story of the eagle and the tortoise, or another of Aesop's fables, and they say, "Oh, did that really happen?" You say, "Oh no, it didn't happen, but it's just to teach you something important." What happens to this passage of the Bible if the preacher gets in the pulpit and says, that never happened, but it's an important story for us to hear and learn from? What happens? What happens to the story? What happens to it? Does it diminish it for you? I see some nodding. Is it actually helpful? Tell me, what do you think about that? What do you think about the invitation to think of this as myth? Capital M, myth. Yeah. Thoughts about that? No. I don't want to answer that question. Yeah. Jonathan, Dean first, and then Jonathan across the way. Yeah.
I don't think it does for me because it's how I reconcile it in my mind.
Yeah.
It's my own belief of it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm going to respond to that in a minute. But Jonathan, on the other side.
I think the invitation to think of it as I like parable because it has more religious context to it, but the invitation to approach it as a parable removes the impetus to literally have to reconcile, did the donkey, did the angel, this, and it invites us to think about the deeper context of why would God do this? Why does Balaam not see? Why can't Balaam call what God has called good bad? Like, it invites us to a deeper engagement with the story when you approach it as a myth or a parable.
Yeah, thank you. So not ignoring the story, but going deeper. Yeah. I think the real tragedy would be for a preacher or a teacher to tell you you have to hear it one way. Like, oh, it doesn't count if it's not this. Or if you think that, you don't understand it. Like, God's people would have been appalled to hear us asking of the text the questions that we ask. Like, they would say, why are you asking that? Like, do you not get what we're doing here? Like, what? It's not, it's like going to a football game and saying, the music is a little off, right? You think, okay, okay, like, did you come for, maybe you came for the music, I don't know. But the text is not presented, the text and what is asked of us by the text is not, do you believe it? Did it happen? That's not the point at all. I think the story is communicating something through the text itself, whether literally true or mythologically true. It's communicating to us something bigger than those questions. Like, those questions kind of miss the whole point of reading the story and holding the story. I don't have an answer for this third question, but how do you think an ancient Israelite, a faithful Israelite, would have heard this? How do you think Jesus knew this story? What do you think Jesus thought of this story? When this came up in the lectionary, didn't really have it like that, but when this came up in the lectionary and Jesus was going to preach on this, like, what do you think he would have preached? How do you hear and read and understand it? The Bible is a wonderful collection of stories that are bigger than any one hearing, any one reading, any one sermon, any one interpretation, any one vacation Bible school lesson. The great stories like this, the stories that we do teach to our children, they lose their essence if we try to boil them down to either historic facts or to plain myth. I think the beauty of it is this sort of ambiguity, and the text allows each of us to hear it, and for us as a community to hear it, and to hear it in our own understanding and in our community understanding. We got a few minutes. Closing thoughts. So what will you take away from this? What will you take away from the story of Balaam? What's the lesson for you? I'd be surprised if any of you said donkeys can speak. I'd be surprised if anybody in the ancient world said, wow, God made a donkey talk. Like, that's amazing. But I don't think the point of the story is that God can make donkeys talk. But what is it? What's your takeaway? What's your takeaway from the passage? How do you hold this? What's the value of this story? What do you think? What's the value for you? What will you take away from this reading of Balaam? Yeah, Sally, up here. That's all right. We appreciate you. Appreciate John running the mic for us. Yes, ma'am.
God has a plan.
God has a plan. Love it. What's your takeaway? What's your takeaway? Yeah.
I resonated with what you were talking about with the kids going across the street, and I think sometimes you can be dead right. So you can be right, and Balaam was right.
Yeah.
But the angel was there on his way doing what he was called. And it says, why would God reveal something to Balaam's donkey before revealing it to him? I don't know. I don't know if it was revealed before. It might have been revealed at the same time, but the donkey was more perceptive, kind of like my dogs. They communicate a storm to me before the storm is there. And so that's what I take away from it is you can be on the right track and think you are doing God's work or following his plan, but then something else comes up, whether it's the angel or God revealing himself in a different way. And if you don't have the humility to hear that communication from the donkey, from the other person, that you think you're still right, it really is kind of hurtful to think, would I strike the donkey?
Yeah.
Would I do this to this other person or say something in my way of trying to be right for God?
Yeah, thank you. I love that. I need to hear that. Yeah. What else? Any other takeaways for you? What else? Maybe a question to ask as we conclude is, what has to be true about God for this story to be shared? What do God's people have to know about God in order for this story to belong in the telling of the account of God's people. Like, you know, in other words, what makes this story true? And it's not just a talking donkey. Like, the reason the story is in the Bible is not just because somebody overheard a donkey talking to Balaam. Funny enough, if you go to a website, or if you look in your concordance, Balaam shows up in the New Testament in 3 places, and every time it shows up, it's deeply critical. That the legend of Balaam is that by the time the story's over, we don't read it, but Balaam teaches the Israelites how to worship false idols, and as a result, they're faithless. So 1 Peter, the book of Revelation, and somewhere else, I can't remember where else, like whenever they blame Balaam for leading God's people astray. And you think that's not in the Bible, but sometimes we need to make even more of the story than what the story tells. But we'll unravel that maybe another series. But what has to be true about the way God is interacting with God's people for us to tell the story and say, yeah, that's a good story. That's a good story. It is not, what comes from the story cannot be contrary or antithetical to who we know God to be throughout the generations, or else the story doesn't get told. People say, that's not right. That's not a part of God's people's story. Right? So what has to be true about the way God interacts with God's people in order for this story to be preserved? Yeah, Diane? Or Cliff? I saw a hand. I didn't know whose hand it was. Yeah, Cliff?
When you look at the donkey, the character of the donkey, and the last thing he does is goes down on his knees. And I see that as a reverence to, I get the point.
Yeah.
Well, then the man has to have an angel come to hear it again, or to experience the point another way. So maybe we have to work at our own listening, and maybe we have to hear it twice to really get where our belief is, how deep we go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think if we tell this story to our children and we tell them, isn't it amazing how God enabled a donkey to speak? We've done them some good. That is amazing. But what about the rest? What about the need to listen more carefully? What about the need to be humble when we realize that we're wrong? What about the need to listen to unexpected sources to show us what we might not be able to see? What about our ability to trust in a God who will reveal something to us if we're only willing to look? Part of the challenge is that when we tell stories like this, we tell this much of the story and not the whole story, right? And so when you read the rest of this chapter and the chapters that follow, all of a sudden we realize, oh, this story isn't about a talking donkey. The talking donkey is just a small piece of the story, right? There's a lot more at work. Well, I'm glad y'all are here. Next week, we're going to look at Jonah and the whale. I hope you've enjoyed today. Thank y'all very much, and I'll see y'all soon.